The sun was a merciless god. It rained from a brassy, cloudless sky, its gaze turning the vast expanse of the Arizona desert into a shimmering anvil. On this anvil lay a sacrifice, a broken figure in what was once a pristine white wedding dress. The silk and lace were now shredded, smeared with dirt and streaks of dried blood, clinging to her like a ghostly shroud. Eleanor Fairchild, Nora, knew she was dying. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her tongue a swollen, useless thing in her mouth. Thirst was no longer a simple craving, it was a physical presence, a clawed beast shredding her throat from the inside out. Each breath was a sip of fire. She stumbled, her worn satin slippers offering no purchase on the loose rock, and fell to her knees. Her vision swam, the towering saguaros with their outstretched arms seeming to mock her, silent green sentinels watching her demise. Delirium, a welcome and terrifying friend, began to whisper to her. It showed her cool Boston fountains, the slick feel of condensation on a glass of lemonade, the gentle patter of rain on a cobblestone street. It showed her his face. Silas. His handsome, respectable face, the one that charmed governors and senators, twisting in her memory into the cold, reptilian mask she had seen in the firelight of his study. The ledger, the names, the accidents. That's what had driven her out here, into this sun-scorched hell. Not a fear of marriage, but a fear of the man she was to marry. She crawled, her nails, once perfectly manicured, broke against the sharp stones. Every inch was a victory paid for in agony. She was no longer a Fairchild of Boston, a debutante lauded for her wit and piano skills. She was a creature primal and desperate, her entire existence narrowed to a single impossible goal. One more breath, one more foot. A shadow fell over her. It was cool, a sudden, impossible respite from the relentless glare. She thought it was a cloud, a final mercy from a pitiless sky, but the shadow did not move. Slowly, with the last dregs of her strength, she lifted her head. A figure stood before her, tall and lean, seeming to be carved from the very rock and heat of the land. He was dark-skinned, his black hair held back by a simple leather band. He carried a bow and wore clothes of soft deerskin that blended into the earth tones of the desert. He watched her, his face an unreadable mask of stone, his dark eyes holding no pity, only a deep, unnerving stillness. Nora opened her mouth to speak, to beg, but only a dry, rasping croak emerged. Her last conscious thought was not one of fear, but of bitter irony. She had fled a monster, only to be found by a savage. Then the world dissolved into a merciful black. Just 2 days prior, the world had been a symphony of cloying perfume and muted congratulations. The year was 1885, and in the burgeoning territorial capital of Prescott, Arizona, the wedding of Silas the Judge Blackwood to Miss Eleanora Fairchild was the grandest event the rugged territory had ever witnessed. Nora stood before a full-length mirror imported from France, a gilded monstrosity that reflected a stranger in white. The dress, a creation of satin and seed pearls that had cost more than most men in this town made in a decade, felt like a cage. Silas was a man of immense power, his influence woven into the very fabric of Arizona. He was handsome in a severe, chiseled way, with silvering temples that lent him an air of distinction, and eyes the color of a winter sky. He had courted Nora with a relentless, calculated precision, showering her with gifts and painting a future of power and prestige. Her father, a Boston merchant with more ambition than sense, had seen the match as a crowning achievement, a way to cement the family's influence in the booming West. Nora, however, had felt a growing unease, a chill that had nothing to do with the cool desert nights. It was in the way Silas's smile never quite reached his eyes. It was in the casual contempt with which he spoke of the local Pima tribes, dismissing them as vermin, squatting on land ripe for improvement. It was in the fleeting moments of cold fury she saw when a servant was too slow or a horse did not obey instantly. This was a man who demanded control, absolute and unquestioning. The night before the wedding, a restless anxiety had driven her from her room. Unable to sleep, she had wandered into Silas's private study, the air thick with the scent of leather and cigar smoke. Looking for a book to calm her nerves, her fingers had brushed against a loose panel behind the bookshelf. Curiosity overriding propriety, she'd pried it open. Inside was not a family heirloom or hidden spirits, but a thick, leather-bound ledger. She had sat in his high-backed chair, the dying embers in the hearth casting flickering shadows on the walls, and read. The neat, elegant script, so at odds with the brutal contents, detailed a shadow empire built on fear. It was a meticulous record of Silas's true business. He wasn't just buying land, he was taking it. The ledger listed small ranchers, homesteaders, and miners. Beside each name were notes: loan extended, exorbitant interest. Water rights diverted. Cattle stampeded. Resistant to sale. And next to a handful of names, a chillingly simple annotation: resolved. She recognized some of them. The Miller family, whose patriarch had died in a supposed hunting accident just last month, leaving his widow to sell their ranch to Silas for a pittance. Mr. Abernathy, a stubborn old farmer, whose barn had mysteriously burned to the ground, forcing him into bankruptcy. It was all there, a cold, calculated campaign of ruin and death, all to feed Silas's insatiable appetite for land and power. He wasn't a pillar of the community, he was a predator, cloaking his savagery in a veneer of law and respectability. The blood had drained from her face. This wasn't just a loveless marriage. It was an alliance with a monster. She was to be his finest acquisition, the ultimate symbol of his legitimacy. The gilded cage she had sensed was, in fact, a serpent's den, and she was to be its prize. The next day, as she walked down the aisle of the packed church, the organ music swelling around her, she saw him waiting. He smiled that perfect public smile, but all she could see were the names in the ledger, the ghosts of the men he had destroyed. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not with bridle nerves, but with the frantic terror of a trapped animal. The preacher's voice began to drone, the words sealing her fate. No. The word was a silent scream in her mind. Not this. Feigning a sudden spell of dizziness, she pressed a hand to her forehead and swayed. Her father, startled, caught her arm. Nora? In the concerned murmur that rippled through the congregation, she saw her chance. While her bridesmaids fussed and her father called for water, she allowed herself to be led towards a side vestibule. Once out of sight, she didn't hesitate. She lifted the heavy skirts of her dress and ran. Out the heavy oak door, into the blinding sunlight and dusty street. She didn't look back. She ran for the livery, her lungs burning, her only thought to put as much distance as possible between herself and the man at the altar. She saddled the first available horse, her hands fumbling with the buckles, her mind a blank slate of pure, unadulterated panic. She rode east, away from the town, away from the church bells that now sounded like a death knell, and into the terrifying, unknown freedom of the Sonoran desert. The desert was a crucible, and it was burning away everything she had been. The first day was a blur of panicked flight. She rode the horse, a sturdy but unremarkable gelding, with a desperate urgency, pushing it far beyond its limits. By the second morning, the horse was faltering, its breath coming in ragged gasps. By noon, it collapsed, its legs buckling, its life expiring in the suffocating heat. The silence that followed its last shuddering breath was absolute, a profound and terrifying loneliness that dwarfed her own suffering. Now on foot, her predicament sharpened into a fine point of agony. The elegant slippers, designed for waltzing on polished floors, were shredded within an hour, leaving her to walk on blistered, bleeding feet. The magnificent dress became a treacherous enemy, its heavy layers trapping heat, its long train snagging on every thorny bush. She ripped at the lace, tearing the skirt to free her legs, the sound of the rending fabric a final, brutal severing from her old life. Her thirst was a living entity. She thought of the Pima, the people Silas had scorned. She had read that they knew how to survive here, how to find water in the desiccated landscape. They could read the secrets of the earth that, to her, was just a meaningless, hostile canvas of rock and sand. She tried to remember what she had read, looking for green foliage that might signal a hidden spring, but the sun-bleached world offered no clues. She was on the verge of giving up, of simply lying down and letting the desert take her, when the shadow fell upon her. She looked up and saw him, the Pima warrior, Kyle. He stood over her, his expression impassive, his dark eyes taking in her state with a clinical detachment. He was from the world she had only read about, a world Silas wanted to erase. In her delirium, she couldn't tell if he was real or a hallucination, a final specter sent to usher her into the next life. Kyle watched the woman. The Na Kai U, a white woman. His hand rested on the hilt of the knife at his belt. His first instinct, a deep-seated impulse born of years of pain and betrayal, was to turn and walk away. His people had learned through bitter experience that nothing good came from involvement with her kind. They brought metal plows that scarred the earth, rifles that slaughtered the buffalo for sport, and diseases that ravaged entire villages. They brought whiskey and lies and broken treaties. This woman, with her strange, tattered white clothes and skin burned raw by the sun, was a symbol of that invading world. But as he looked closer, he saw past the symbol. He saw the raw, bloody feet. He saw the lips, cracked and blackened. He saw the desperation in her eyes, a look that transcended race and language. It was the look of any living thing fighting to hold on to the last threads of life. To leave her here would be to abandon a rabbit to a coyote, a fawn to a wildfire. It was not the Pima Mikai way. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. To have strength and not use it to protect the helpless is to have no strength at all. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his ancestors' sorrow, he unslung the waterskin from his shoulder. He knelt, his movements fluid and economical, and gently lifted her head. He let a few drops of precious water fall onto her lips. She moaned, a sound of pure animal relief. He saw the fight in her, the stubborn spark that had somehow kept her moving this far. It was a spirit he recognized, a spirit that mirrored the resilience of his own people. Against his better judgment, against the cold, hard logic of survival, he made a choice. He gathered her limp form into his arms, she weighed almost nothing, and carefully lifted her onto his horse. He mounted behind her, his arms securely around her waist, and turned his horse back towards the hidden canyon that was his temporary home. Nora awoke to the sound of trickling water and the smell of roasting meat. The world returned to her in soft, gentle waves, a stark contrast to the violent assault of the desert. She was lying on a bed of soft furs inside a small, natural alcove in a rock wall. A small, smokeless fire crackled nearby, its warmth chasing away a chill she hadn't realized had settled deep in her bones. Her tattered wedding dress was gone. In its place, she wore a simple, sleeveless tunic made of soft, supple deerskin. It was surprisingly comfortable. The Pima warrior, Kyle, sat by the fire, sharpening an obsidian arrowhead with a piece of sandstone. He moved with an unhurried, deliberate grace, his focus absolute. He glanced at her, his expression as unreadable as before, then offered her a wooden bowl filled with a thin, savory broth. She drank it slowly, the warm liquid a balm to her ravaged throat. The first days were a silent pact. There were no words, for they had none to share. Their communication was a pantomime of necessity. He would point to a plant, then crush its leaves and rub them on a rock, showing her it was poison. He would point to another, a humble-looking cactus, and with a swift, expert motion of his knife, slice it open to reveal the watery pulp inside. Nora, a student of languages and literature, found herself in a world where words were useless, and the grammar of survival was the only language that mattered. She was a surprisingly apt pupil, her sharp mind absorbing every lesson, her desperation fueling her concentration. She learned to be quiet, to move with a deliberation that conserved energy. She learned that the desert was not empty but full of life, a complex ecosystem that she had been blind to. Kyle, in turn, began to see her as more than just a helpless burden. He saw her watch his hands as he wove cordage from yucca fibers, her eyes sharp with intelligence. He saw her, without being asked, meticulously clean the small camp, organizing his few belongings with an innate sense of order. He had expected tears and complaints. The hallmarks of the white women he had encountered at trading posts, he received none. Instead, he saw a quiet, steely resolve. One evening, as the sky bled purple and orange, Nora felt strong enough to try and explain. She took a charred stick from the fire and began to draw in the sandy soil of the canyon floor. She drew a crude building with a cross on top, a church. Then a stick figure of a man with a large hat and a cruel, downturned mouth. She drew a bag of money next to him and then a book. She looked up at Kale, her eyes pleading for him to understand. She pointed to herself, then to the man, and shook her head violently. She drew herself running, a long, winding line leading into a series of jagged shapes meant to be the desert. Kyle watched her crude drawings, his silence unnerving. He understood more than she realized. He had seen men like the one she drew. Men like Silas Blackwood, whose name was a curse whispered among the Pima, the man who was systematically squeezing them from their ancestral lands. He picked up the stick, and next to her drawing of the cruel man, he drew a snake, a coiled rattler with its fangs bared. He looked at Nora, a flicker of understanding passing between them. He now knew what she had run from. Not a wedding, but a predator. Later that night, Kyle climbed to the top of the canyon rim, a sentinel scanning his domain. Nora followed, her bare feet surprisingly sure on the familiar rock. In the far distance, miles away across the dark expanse, they saw it. A series of tiny, flickering lights moving in a slow, deliberate line. Torches. A search party. They were still hunting her. Kale looked down at Nora, her face illuminated by the cold light of the moon. He saw the fear in her eyes, but beneath it, a nascent defiance. In that moment, the line between them, the line of race, of culture, of language, seemed to blur. They were no longer a Pima warrior and a white woman. They were the hunted, and the hunters were coming. His hand instinctively went to the bow on his back. He gave a short, sharp nod. The unspoken message was clear. They will not find you. The uneasy truce had been forged into an alliance, bound by the light of the enemy's fire. In Prescott, Judge Silas Blackwood presented the perfect portrait of a man distraught. He accepted condolences with a grave, dignified sorrow, his hand often going to his heart as he spoke of his poor, lost Eleonora. He spoke of her delicate constitution, her unfamiliarity with the harshness of the West, and his fears that she had become disoriented and wandered into the wilderness. He posted a reward of $1,000, a staggering sum for any information leading to her safe return. The notice, plastered in every saloon, post office, and general store in the territory, turned Nora into the most sought-after person in Arizona. But behind the closed doors of his opulent home, the mask of grief was discarded. There was only a cold, reptilian fury. He stood before the fireplace, the same fireplace where Nora had discovered his secret, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. She had not simply jilted him, she had defied him. She had stolen his property, for that is how he saw her, and more importantly, she held the key to his ruin. That ledger, if it fell into the right hands, would unravel the entire tapestry of his power. "Find her," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Across from him stood Jedediah Kane, a man whose face was a roadmap of violent encounters. Kane was Silas's right hand, his enforcer, a man who operated in the shadows that his employer's public life cast. He was tall and gaunt, with pale, lifeless eyes that seemed to absorb the light around them. He cleaned his fingernails with the tip of a Bowie knife as Silas spoke. "The reward notice says, 'Safe return, Judge,'" Kane said, his voice a dry rasp. Silas turned from the fire, his own eyes burning with a cold light that was far more terrifying than any open flame. "The notice is for the public, you fool. It's to make me look like the grieving fiancé. It's to turn every dirt-scratching prospector and half-wit cowboy into my eyes and ears. Your instructions are different." He walked closer, invading Kane's personal space. "I don't care how you do it. I don't care who gets in your way. Find her, and when you do, make sure she can never speak of what she saw in my study. There can be no body, no evidence, just another tragic soul lost to the desert. Do you understand me, Jedediah?" "Perfectly," Kane said, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his thin lips. He slid the knife back into its sheath. "Consider her a ghost." Kane and his posse of 5 hand-picked men rode out of Prescott that afternoon. They were not rescuers, they were executioners. They were a plague upon the land, their questions backed by the butt of a pistol and the threat of a noose. Their first stop was a small, hard-scrabble farmstead a dozen miles east of town. The farmer, a weary man with kind eyes, admitted to giving a frantic woman in a ruined dress a ladle of water a few days back. That admission was his undoing. Kane's men tore the place apart, searching for clues, their casual brutality a spectacle of terror. When the farmer protested, Kane himself pistol-whipped him to the ground in front of his screaming wife and children. "She came this way," Kane said, wiping the farmer's blood from the barrel of his Colt. "Let's ride." He tossed a few coins on the ground next to the groaning man. "For the water." The message was clear, and it would ripple across the territory. Helping the runaway bride was an invitation to ruin. Silas Blackwood's wrath had been unleashed. Their world shrank to the rhythm of pursuit and evasion. Kael's knowledge of the high desert was their only shield against Kane's relentless hunt. He led Nora through a maze of arroyos and canyons, a secret geography known only to the Pima. They traveled mostly at night, the moon their guide, resting during the brutal heat of the day in hidden alcoves or under the shade of ancient cottonwoods. Kael taught Nora to walk without leaving a trace, to use the rock and hard-baked earth to hide their passage. The pressure was immense, a constant, nagging fear that settled in the pit of Nora's stomach. Every strange sound, every dust devil on the horizon could be them Masumoam. One moonless night, as they refilled their water skins at a secluded spring, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the canyon walls. Kane's posse. They were closer than ever. Kael grabbed Nora's hand, his touch firm and reassuring, and pulled her into a narrow fissure in the rock face, a space barely wide enough for them to squeeze into. They stood in the suffocating darkness, their bodies pressed together, listening as the riders passed by, their voices and the jingle of their spurs terrifyingly close. Nora could smell the sweat and leather of their pursuers, could feel the vibrations of their horses' hooves through the rock. She held her breath until her lungs burned, her heart hammering a wild tattoo against Kael's chest. The moment stretched into an eternity before the sounds faded into the distance. Only then did she allow herself to breathe, her body trembling with a mixture of terror and relief. Days later, they stumbled upon a ghost town, a collection of sun-bleached, decaying buildings clinging to the side of a mountain. It was a skeleton of a place, a monument to a gold rush that had come and gone. They decided to risk resting in the relative shelter of the old assayer's office. It was a mistake. Kane, a tracker of formidable skill, had found their trail. The attack came without warning. A rifle shot splintered the doorframe next to Nora's head, showering her with wooden shrapnel. "They found us!" she yelled, her voice raw with panic. The ghost town erupted into a cacophony of gunfire. Bullets tore through the rotten wood of the walls, kicking up clouds of dust. Kael pushed her to the floor, his body shielding hers. "Stay down!" he commanded. He crawled to the window, his bow in hand, and loosed an arrow. A scream from outside told him it had found its mark. The firefight was a chaotic, desperate ballet of survival. Kael, using his bow with silent, deadly accuracy, picked off their attackers from the shadows. Nora, her fear transmuting into a cold, focused anger, found an old, heavy Colt left behind by some long-gone prospector. Her hands shook as she checked its load. She remembered Kael's lessons. Breathe, squeeze, don't jerk. She saw one of Kane's men trying to flank their position, moving between the old saloon and the blacksmith shop. Taking a deep breath, she rested the heavy barrel on the windowsill, aimed, and fired. The recoil slammed her shoulder, and the noise was deafening, but the man cried out and dropped his rifle, clutching a wounded arm. A look of stunned disbelief crossed her face. She had done it. She had fought back. The exchange of fire gave Kael the opening he needed. He laid down a rapid volley of arrows, forcing the remaining men to take cover. "Now!" he yelled. They scrambled out the back of the building, moving low and fast, using the decaying structures as cover. A bullet grazed Kael's arm, a hot, searing pain, but he didn't slow down. They ran, the sounds of the gunfight fading behind them, plunging deeper into the maze of mountains. They had escaped, but they were bloodied, and they knew Kane would not give up. He was like a wolf, and now he had the scent of blood. Survival had a price, and that price was supplies. Their food was gone, Kael's makeshift bandage was soaked through, and they were running low on ammunition for the old Colt. Their flight forced them towards the dusty, fly-blown settlement of Agua Fria, a place that was less a town and more a temporary truce between honest folk and outlaws. It was a desperate gamble. A Pima warrior and a white woman dressed in a warrior's tunic would draw attention they could not afford. As they walked down the town's single, dusty street, they could feel the eyes on them. Men stopped talking and turned to stare from the shaded porch of the general store. Women pulled their children close. The air was thick with suspicion. Nora pulled her hat low, trying to hide her face, but there was no hiding their otherness. Their first stop was the doctor's office. The doctor, a man named Elias Thorne's brother, was old and weary, his eyes clouded with a deep sadness. He looked at Cale's arm, then at Nora, and seemed to understand everything without a word being said. "Gunshot," he stated, not a question. He cleaned and stitched the wound with practiced hands, his touch surprisingly gentle. "The man you're running from," he said, his voice low. "He casts a long shadow over this land." He refused payment, pressing a small bottle of carbolic acid and a roll of clean bandages into Nora's hands. "Godspeed," he whispered, a prayer and a dismissal in one. Their next stop was the general store. The proprietor, a man with a nervous twitch, sold them beans, flour, and cartridges, his eyes darting towards the door the entire time. He overcharged them, and they paid without argument. As they were about to leave, the batwing doors of the saloon across the street swung open and a man stepped out. Sheriff Elias Thorne. He was a big man, his bulk straining the seams of his vest, a silver star pinned crookedly upon it. He was not a fool. He knew exactly who they were. The reward posters with Nora's face, sketched from a Boston society portrait, were nailed to the wall right behind him. He walked towards them, his hand resting on the butt of his gun, his expression a mixture of duty and regret. "Folks," he said, his voice a tired drawl, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." "We've done nothing wrong, Sheriff," Nora said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her gut. "Ma'am," Thorne sighed, "in this territory, being wanted by Judge Blackwood is wrong enough. I have a duty." He looked from Nora's defiant face to Cale's stony silence. He saw the wound on Cale's arm. He was a man trapped. He was on Silas's payroll, a fact that allowed him to maintain a fragile peace in his town. But he had a conscience, and it was screaming at him. "Look, Al," he said, lowering his voice. "He just wants you back. He's a powerful man. You can't win this fight. Surrender to me. I'll see you get back to Prescott in one piece. I swear it." "And what happens then?" Nora challenged, her eyes flashing. "Do you think he'll just forgive and forget?" Thorne had no answer. He knew what would happen. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I'm giving you a chance. Don't make me take it away." Before the standoff could escalate, the saloon doors swung open again, and three rough-looking men spilled out into the street, their eyes lit with greed. Bounty hunters. "Well, well, Sheriff," their leader, a mountain of a man with a greasy beard, sneered. "Looks like you found our $1,000. The situation exploded. The bounty hunters went for their guns, not caring about the sheriff. Cale reacted instantly, shoving Nora behind him and drawing his knife. Thorne, his hand forced, drew his own pistol. "Hold it! This is my town!" But the bounty hunters were drunk on greed and whiskey. The ensuing fight was a maelstrom of violence. One of the men lunged at Cale, who moved with a dancer's grace, his knife flashing. The sheriff fired a warning shot into the air, which only added to the chaos. The big leader grabbed for Nora, his grimy hands tangling in her tunic. "Got you, pretty bird!" he roared. A primal rage erupted in Nora. She was not a prize to be won, not a bird to be caged. Not anymore. She grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from a nearby vendor's cart and swung it with all her might, connecting with the side of the man's head with a sickening crack. He staggered back, his eyes wide with surprise, before crumpling to the ground. The moment of shock was all they needed. Cale grabbed Nora's arm. "Go, now!" They ran, ducking into an alleyway as Thorne and the remaining bounty hunter exchanged shots. They didn't stop running until the sounds of Agua Fria were a faint echo behind them. They had escaped again, but the world was shrinking, the walls closing in. There was nowhere left to run where Silas Blackwood's influence couldn't reach. The desert became their sanctuary once more. In the vast, silent wilderness, away from the grasping hands of civilization, the bond between Nora and Cale deepened, forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal. The nights were their own. Under a blanket of stars so bright they seemed to drip from the sky, the barriers between them continued to fall. Nora, who had once debated poetry in Boston parlors, now debated the best way to track a deer. Kyle, who had seen his world shrink with every new fence post, now listened as Nora described a world of oceans and sprawling cities, her voice painting pictures of things he could barely imagine. He taught her the Pima names for the constellations, stories of the Creator and the Coyote, legends that were woven into the very fabric of the stars which they watched. She, in turn, read to him from the single, small book of Shakespeare's sonnets she had inexplicably saved, tucked into the pocket of her wedding dress and somehow surviving the ordeal. Her voice was soft in the stillness, the timeless words of love and loss echoing in the ancient landscape. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" she read, the firelight dancing on her face. Kyle listened, not understanding all the words, but feeling their weight, their melody. "Our summer days are not kind," he said, a rare smile touching his lips. "He should have compared you to the night bloom cactus. It waits in the harshest sun, and only when the world is dark and safe does it show its true beauty." Nora's heart fluttered at his words, a sentiment so pure and unexpected it left her breathless. In that moment, she knew that what she felt for him was no longer just gratitude or camaraderie. It was a love as fierce and resilient as the desert itself. He continued her training with the rifle, his patience endless. "You think like a na-kai-a," he would tell her. "You try to force the bullet where you want it to go. You must let it go. Become part of the rifle, the wind, the target. It is one movement, one thought." She practiced for hours, the heavy Colt becoming an extension of her arm. The frustration of her early misses slowly gave way to the quiet satisfaction of competence. Their journey took them into higher country, a land of pine-dotted mesas and steep ravines. It was here they encountered a different kind of danger. As they watered their horses in a secluded stream, they were suddenly surrounded. Not by Kane's men, but by a band of 6 Apache warriors, their faces painted for war, their rifles held at the ready. They were the traditional enemies of the Pima, their rivalry as old as the mountains. Kale's body went rigid, but he showed no fear. He raised an open hand, the universal sign of peace. He spoke to them not in English or Spanish, but in their own tongue, a dialect he knew from past encounters. His voice was calm, respectful. Nora stood behind him, her hand on the grip of the Colt tucked into her belt, her heart pounding. Kale did not plead. He spoke of the land. He spoke of the new threat, the white man who sought to devour it all, Apache and Pima alike. He spoke of Silas Blackwood, a name they recognized. He gestured to Nora. He told them she was running from this man, that she was an enemy of their common enemy. The Apache leader, a man with eyes as sharp and hard as obsidian, listened, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the world held its breath. Then, the leader gave a curt nod. He and his men lowered their rifles and simply melted back into the trees, disappearing as silently as they had come. They had been allowed to pass. The encounter was a stark reminder that the loyalties of this land were complex and shifting, a web of ancient animosities and new shared threats. But their luck was running out. Kane was a gifted hunter, and he was driven by the promise of reward and the fear of Silas's displeasure. He tracked them to the edge of a series of ancient cliff dwellings, the abandoned homes of the Anasazi people, built into the face of a sheer canyon wall. The ambush was perfectly executed. They were halfway up a narrow path when the first shot rang out, kicking up dust at Kale's feet. They were trapped, exposed on the cliff face. "Into the dwellings!" Kale yelled, shoving Nora towards an opening in the rock. As she scrambled inside, Kale turned to provide covering fire, his bow a blur of motion. It was a heroic but costly act. A rifle slug caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him against the rock wall. He cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain, and crumpled to the ground. Nora screamed his name. She scrambled back out and, under a hail of gunfire, dragged him into the relative safety of the cliff house. He was bleeding profusely, his face pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Outside, she could hear Kane's voice, triumphant and cruel. "Nowhere left to run, you murdering savage! Send out the girl, and I might let you die quick!" Nora looked at Kyle, fading fast. She looked at the single entrance to their small cave. She looked at the old Colt in her hand. The fear was a cold, sickening wave, but something else rose to meet it. A white-hot, protective fury. They had hurt him. They were going to kill him, and she was the only thing standing in their way. All the lessons, all the hardship, all the running had led to this single, terrifying moment. Her transformation was complete. The debutante from Boston was gone, and in her place was a woman who would fight to the death for the man she loved. The hours that followed were a descent into a waking nightmare. Kyle's fever spiked, his strong body racked with shudders, his words a delirious jumble of Pima and broken English. The cliff dwelling, once a sanctuary, became a prison. Below, Kane and his men had made camp, confident that their quarry was trapped and bleeding out. They were in no hurry. Nora, however, was a revelation, even to herself. The panic that had threatened to consume her was burned away by the fire of necessity. A profound, almost preternatural calm settled over her. Every action was deliberate, focused. Kale had saved her life. Now she would save his. She tore strips from her own tunic to create fresh bandages. Using the precious carbolic acid from the Agua Fria doctor, she cleaned the wound as best she could. It was a gruesome task. The bullet was still in him, lodged deep in the muscle of his shoulder. She could feel it with her probing fingers. He moaned in his delirium, and tears streamed down her face, but her hands did not tremble. She knew that infection, not Kane's men, was their most immediate enemy. She remembered the lessons Kale had taught her. She recognized the low-growing feverfew plant near the entrance of the cave, its leaves a natural analgesic. She crushed them into a poultice and applied it to the wound. She rationed their water, giving most of it to Kale, forcing him to drink even when he was barely conscious. Night fell. The campfire of Kane's men was a taunting orange eye in the darkness below. Nora sat with the Colt across her lap, her back to the cave wall watching the entrance. She did not sleep. She listened to Kyle's ragged breathing, her own heart aching with every pained gasp. She whispered to him, her voice low and steady. She told him stories of Boston, of the sea, of snow. She recited the sonnets he loved, her voice a fragile anchor in the stormy sea of his fever. "You will not die," she told him, her words a promise, a command. "I will not allow it." For 2 days and 2 nights, she held her vigil. She became a creature of the rock, her senses honed to a razor's edge. She learned the rhythms of their captors' camp, the changing of their guards. On the second day, her thirst becoming unbearable, she used a length of cordage and Kyle's waterskin to lower it down a dark, narrow crevice at the back of the cave, pulling it up blessedly heavy with cool, clean water from some hidden seep. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. On the third morning, Kyle's fever broke. He woke to see Nora's face, pale and exhausted, but her eyes were clear and full of a fierce, unwavering strength. He saw the clean bandage on his shoulder, the small supply of water, the rifle held expertly in her lap. He saw that she had not just nursed him, she had protected him. She had become his guardian. He tried to speak, but his voice was a hoarse whisper. "Nora." She put a finger to his lips. "Rest," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I have it under control." He looked at her, at this woman who had transformed from a fragile refugee into a desert warrior. The love he felt for her was overwhelming, a deep, powerful current that swept away all his old prejudices and fears. She had faced the worst the world could throw at her and had not broken. She had been forged anew in the crucible of courage. They could not stay. Kyle was weak, and their supplies were dwindling. Kane would eventually grow impatient and storm their position. "We can't win a direct fight," Kale rasped, his mind clear despite the pain. "We must choose the ground." "We're not going to fight them," Nora said, her voice filled with a new, hard-won authority. "We're going to fight him, Silas." A plan began to form between them, a desperate, audacious gamble. They weren't just going to escape, they were going to turn the tables. They would use Silas's own arrogance and paranoia as a weapon against him. They would lure the serpent from his den. Their escape from the cliff dwellings was a masterpiece of stealth and daring. Under the cover of a moonless night, Nora lowered the wounded Kale down the cliff face on a rope woven from their tunics and belts, a terrifying, silent descent into the darkness. They slipped past Kane's sleeping sentries, melting into the landscape that was Kyle's true home. They left a false trail leading north, a ruse to buy them precious time. Then they turned south. Their destination was Kyle's village, a collection of modest adobe and brush homes nestled in a fertile river valley, land that Silas Blackwood coveted. They arrived, exhausted and on the brink of collapse, and were met with a mixture of concern for their warrior and deep suspicion of the white woman he brought with him. Kyle, leaning heavily on Nora for support, gathered the tribal elders. In the council lodge, his voice weak but firm, he told them everything. He spoke of Silas's ledger, of his plan to steal this very land. He spoke of Nora's courage, of how she had fought by his side. Nora then spoke, her voice clear and strong. She did not plead or promise. She spoke the truth. "The man who wants your land is the same man who tried to own me," she said, her eyes meeting those of the skeptical elders. "He sees us all as things to be used or discarded. I am not asking you to fight my battle. I am asking you to fight for your homes, for your future. Together we can show him that we are not things. We are people, and we will not be broken." Her words, and Kyle's impassioned plea, swayed them. They saw the truth in her eyes. They had seen Silas's surveyors, had felt his pressure. They agreed to help. The next part of the plan was a message sent with a trusted Pima youth to Agua Fria. It was addressed to Sheriff Elias Thorne. It contained no threats, no pleas. It simply listed a half-dozen names from Silas's ledger, men Thorne had known, men whose ruin or death had been a source of whispered gossip and quiet shame in his town. At the bottom, Nora had written a single question. Whose name is next? It was a direct challenge to the sheriff's buried conscience. The final piece of the trap was the bait. They found a known informant, a man who traded information for whiskey, and let him overhear a conversation. The story was that Nora had been captured by Kyle's people who were holding her for ransom. They were keeping her at the old, abandoned Mission San Xavier del Desierto, a crumbling ruin in the foothills. The bait was Nora. The target was Silas. They knew his obsessive need for control would never allow him to delegate this. He would have to come and see to the end of it himself. The bait was taken. Silas Blackwood, his face a thunderous mask of rage, rode out from Prescott with Jedediah Kane and a posse of 20 of his most ruthless men. The idea that a band of savages would dare to hold his property for ransom was an insult that could only be answered with annihilation. The informant's story had played perfectly on his arrogance. He arrived at the Mission San Xavier as the sun began its slow, bloody descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and crimson. The mission was a skeleton, its adobe walls crumbling, its bell tower a jagged finger pointing at the sky. A profound silence hung over the place. Too silent. "Spread out," Kane ordered, his pale eyes scanning the ruins. "Find the girl." As his men dismounted and moved into the mission courtyard, the world erupted. The first sign of the trap was not a gunshot, but a volley of arrows, silent and deadly, appearing as if from the air itself. 3 of Silas's men fell before they even knew they were under attack. Pima warriors, their bodies painted to match the fading light and dusty adobe, rose from the ruins, from the shadows, from the very earth. They were ghosts, their war cries a chilling chorus that echoed off the crumbling walls. The courtyard became a charnel house. Silas's men, caught completely by surprise, fired wildly into the shadows, their panic palpable. Silas, his face white with fury and a dawning fear, was hustled into the relative safety of the main chapel by Kane. Inside the cavernous, roofless chapel, they found Nora. She was not tied up or crying. She stood at the far end, near the ruined altar, the old Colt held steady in her hands. Cale was beside her, his arm in a sling, but his eyes were alive with the fire of battle, a bow in his good hand. "Silas," Nora said, her voice calm and clear, ringing through the chaos. "Your reign is over." "You," he snarled, his composure finally cracking. "You foolish girl. You think this little Indian uprising can stop me?" He raised his own ornate pistol. "You should have been my wife, my property." "I am no one's property," Nora declared, her voice resonating with the power of a woman who had found her own soul. Before Silas could fire, a new voice cut through the air. "Drop it, Judge!" Sheriff Elias Thorne stood in the chapel's main doorway, a double-barreled shotgun leveled at Silas's chest. His face was grim, his eyes filled with a newfound resolve. Behind him stood a dozen men, the ranchers and farmers from his town, the families Silas had ruined, their faces hard, their hands holding rifles. The message Nora had sent had done its work. The sheriff had finally chosen a side, eh? Cain, ever the loyal dog, reacted with pure instinct. He shoved Silas aside and raised his pistol to fire at Nora. But a shadow moved from the side of the altar. Kyle, with a speed that defied his injury, launched himself at Cain. The two men crashed to the floor in a brutal, desperate struggle. It was a fight between two predators, a whirlwind of fists and fury, ending only when Kale plunged his knife into Cain's heart. Silas, seeing his enforcer fall, seeing the armed, accusing faces in the doorway, knew he was beaten. He made a desperate run for a side exit, but his path was blocked by Pima warriors, their faces grim, their weapons ready. He turned, his eyes wild with terror, a cornered rat. He was surrounded by his victims, by the ghosts he had created. His empire of fear had crumbled to dust around him. He dropped his pistol, his hands raised in surrender, a pathetic, broken man. The ledger, carefully preserved by Kyle's people, was placed in Sheriff Thorne's hands. Justice in the Wild West was often a swift and brutal affair. But for Silas Blackwood, a long, slow reckoning in a federal court awaited him. A fate for a man like him far worse than a quick death. The first light of dawn spilled over the horizon, washing the desert in soft pastels. The violence of the night seemed a distant dream. Silas and the survivors of his posse were being led away by Sheriff Thorne and his new impromptu deputies. The land was quiet again. Nora and Kyle stood on a high mesa overlooking the valley, the mission a small, quiet shape below them. The air was cool and clean. Kale's arm was freshly bandaged, and while he was weak, the fire had returned to his eyes. Nora stood beside him, no longer in a warrior's tunic or a ruined wedding dress, but in simple, practical clothes, given to her by the Pima women. She looked like she belonged here. Her old life was a ghost. She could never go back to Boston, to a world that suddenly seemed small and colorless. She had found something in the desert, in the struggle, in him. She had found herself. The future was a vast, unwritten page. The challenges were immense. They were from two different worlds, and the prejudices of the age would not simply vanish with Silas Blackwood. But as they stood together, watching the sun climb higher, the future did not seem daunting. It seemed like an invitation. "Where do we go from here?" Nora asked, her voice quiet, filled not with the fear of the unknown, but with a calm sense of wonder. Kyle turned to look at her, his dark eyes filled with a love and respect that ran deeper than any words. He reached out with his good hand and gently touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. A slow smile spread across his lips. "Wherever we want," he said. He took her hand, their fingers lacing together, a perfect fit. They turned from the sunrise and walked towards their horses. They rode off not towards Prescott or Boston, not towards a settled life, but west, into the endless, beautiful, and wild expanse of the land that had saved them both. Their story was over, but their journey was just beginning. And the legend they left behind, whispered on the dusty winds of Arizona, was not one of a lost bride, but of a woman who found her home, a warrior who found his heart, and a love that bloomed in the most unforgiving of lands.